You're going to walk back into that room and tell the attending physician that patient needs to wait another hour for surgery.
Evelyn Reed's hands trembled as she gripped the medication chart, the detective's words hitting her like ice water. Detective Harrison Blackwood loomed over her in the narrow hospital corridor, his partner Detective James Torino blocking her path back to the trauma bay. Through the glass doors behind them, she could see the monitors surrounding her patient, a young black man whose vitals were deteriorating by the minute. "I can't do that," Evelyn whispered, her voice barely audible above the chaos of the emergency department. "He has internal bleeding. Every minute we delay." "Every minute you delay following our instructions," Torino interrupted, stepping closer, "is another minute you're interfering with an active police investigation. You understand what that means for a nurse who's only been here 3 months?" The words sent a chill down Evelyn's spine. 3 months. They'd done their homework. They knew exactly how vulnerable she was, how desperately she needed this job after the nightmare that had consumed her life just 6 months ago. The image of her younger brother Marcus flashed through her mind, handcuffed, bleeding, thrown against a police car while she screamed from the sidewalk, powerless to help him. "Look at us when we're talking to you," Blackwood commanded, his voice carrying that particular tone she'd learned to fear. The same tone the officers had used when they'd arrested Marcus for a crime he didn't commit, when they'd ignored her pleas about his asthma medication, when they dismissed her concerns about the bruises covering his face. Evelyn forced herself to meet Blackwood's eyes. "What investigation? That man in there is dying. He was brought in by ambulance with no police escort, no indication of criminal activity. He's a patient, not a suspect." Torino pulled out his phone and showed her a photo, surveillance footage of a convenience store robbery. "This patient of yours robbed a store 2 hours ago. Shot the clerk. We need him stable enough to confess before his lawyer shows up and ruins everything." "Then arrest him," Evelyn said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "But I'm not delaying his medical care. That's not how this works." "That's exactly how this works," Blackwood said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "See, we've been watching you, Nurse Reed. We know about your brother's troubles. We know about the lawsuit you filed that got thrown out. We know you need this job to pay for his legal fees." The corridor seemed to shrink around them. Other nurses hurried past, deliberately avoiding eye contact, a familiar dance Evelyn had witnessed too many times. The willful blindness that allowed injustice to flourish in the shadows. "We also know," Torino continued, "that the head of this hospital's board is very good friends with our captain. One phone call, and your little crusade for justice ends with you losing your license. Your brother stays in prison, and you can't help him or anyone else." Through the glass, Evelyn watched the patient's blood pressure numbers dropping on the monitor. 26 years old, according to his chart. The same age Marcus had been when they'd arrested him. She thought about the promise she'd made to her mother at Marcus's trial, that she'd never let another family go through what they'd endured, that she'd use her position to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. "Here's what's going to happen," Blackwood said, pulling out a modified incident report. "You're going to sign this amended report stating that the patient was combative and had to be sedated for an additional hour before surgery could proceed safely. Clean, simple, gives us the time we need." Evelyn stared at the paper. The lies were typed in neat, official-looking fonts that made them seem almost legitimate. She could see how it would work, how this small compromise would lead to bigger ones, how each signature would make the next betrayal easier. "And if I refuse?" "Then you're interfering with a police investigation," Torino said. "We arrest you right here, right now. Hospital calls it an unfortunate misunderstanding, fires you to distance themselves from the controversy. Your brother's appeal gets delayed indefinitely because you can't afford his lawyer anymore. And that patient dies anyway because the replacement nurse doesn't know his medical history." The ultimatum hung in the air like poison gas. Evelyn could feel the weight of everyone's eyes. The other nurses who'd stopped pretending not to watch, the security guard who'd positioned himself within earshot, the attending physician Dr. Charlotte Webb who was conspicuously absent from this conversation despite being paged 3 times. "You have 30 seconds to decide," Blackwood said, checking his watch with theatrical precision. "Sign the report, delay the surgery, and everyone walks away happy. Or destroy your life and your brother's future for a career criminal who probably won't survive anyway." Evelyn looked at the patient through the glass one more time. His eyes were closed, but she could see the rapid, shallow breathing that indicated severe blood loss. In her mind, she saw Marcus on the courtroom floor, collapsing from an asthma attack while guards debated whether to help him. She remembered the helpless rage, the the systematic denial of basic human dignity disguised as proper procedure. Hey, my friend, hope you're doing well. Drop a comment and let me know how you're feeling about this story so far and where you are watching from. Some stories are too close to my heart to share on YouTube. I send those, along with little life lessons and surprises, to my email circle. If you'd like to be part of it, you can join with the link in the description. The pen felt impossibly heavy in Evelyn's hand as she took it from Blackwood. She could feel her heartbeat in her throat, could taste the metallic fear that had become so familiar over the past 6 months. The same fear that had kept her silent when Marcus was beaten. The same fear that had made her withdraw her lawsuit when the threats became too intense. But as she looked at the patient's medical chart, noting his elevated heart rate, his dropping hemoglobin levels, the clear signs of internal trauma that required immediate surgical intervention, something shifted inside her. This wasn't about her anymore. This wasn't about Marcus, or her job, or even her own safety. This was about the moment when someone in a position of power had to choose between what was easy and what was right. "Time's up," Torino said, reaching for the pen. Evelyn pulled her hand back and met both detectives' eyes with a calm she didn't know she possessed. "No." The word fell between them like a stone dropping into still water, creating ripples that would soon become waves. "Excuse me." Blackwood's voice carried genuine surprise, as if the possibility of refusal hadn't occurred to him. "I said no. I'm not signing anything, I'm not delaying his surgery, and I'm not letting this man die so you can extract a confession." Evelyn's voice grew stronger with each word. "And if you arrest me for doing my job, I guarantee you that every news outlet in this city will know about it within the hour." Torino laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You think anyone cares about another nurse with a persecution complex? You think your word means anything against ours?" "Maybe not," Evelyn said, reaching into her scrub's pocket and pulling out her phone. The screen showed a recording app, timer running. "But I think this conversation might be very interesting to a lot of people. Especially the part where you asked me to falsify medical records and delay emergency surgery." The corridor went silent except for the steady beeping of monitors and the distant sound of ambulance sirens. Blackwood's face had gone completely white, while Torino's eyes fixed on the phone with laser focus. "You recorded us without consent," Blackwood said, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "That's illegal wiretapping." "This is a public corridor in a hospital," Evelyn replied, her nursing training kicking in as adrenaline flooded her system. "No expectation of privacy. And even if it was illegal, falsifying medical records is a felony. Forcing medical personnel to delay emergency care is criminal conspiracy. Threatening someone's livelihood to coerce false testimony is extortion." She could see the exact moment when both detectives realized they'd underestimated her. The moment when they understood that the quiet, traumatized nurse they'd expected to intimidate had been replaced by someone who'd found her line in the sand. "So here's what's actually going to happen," Evelyn continued, stepping toward the trauma bay doors. "I'm going to walk through these doors and tell Dr. Webb that this patient needs surgery immediately. You're going to leave this hospital and conduct your investigation without interfering with medical care. And if you ever try to coerce hospital staff into compromising patient care again, this recording goes to every news station, medical board, and civil rights organization in the state." The silence stretched between them like a taut wire ready to snap. Through the glass, Evelyn could see the patient's numbers continuing to drop. Every second of this standoff was potentially costing him his life. Finally, Blackwood spoke, his voice deadly quiet. "You have no idea what you're starting here, Nurse Reed. No idea who you're messing with or what the consequences will be." "You're right," Evelyn said, placing her hand on the trauma bay door. "I don't know what the consequences will be. But I know what they'll be if I don't act. And I can live with uncertainty. I can't live with watching someone die because I was too afraid to do the right thing." As she pushed through the doors into the trauma bay, Evelyn heard Torino's voice behind her. "This isn't over." She didn't turn around. Instead, she walked directly to the patient's bedside and began checking his vitals, her hands steady despite the earthquake happening inside her chest. The numbers confirmed what she'd feared. They had minutes, not hours. "Dr. Webb to Trauma Bay 3, Stat," she announced over the intercom, her voice carrying across the emergency department with crystal clarity. "Patient requires immediate surgical intervention for internal bleeding." As she prepared the emergency medication that would stabilize him for surgery, Evelyn caught sight of her own reflection in the monitor screen. For the first time in 6 months, she recognized the person looking back at her. Not the broken sister who'd failed to protect Marcus. Not the intimidated employee afraid of losing her job. Someone who'd remembered that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the cost. The trauma bay doors burst open as Dr. Webb and the surgical team rushed in, but Evelyn barely heard their urgent voices coordinating the emergency procedure. Her attention was fixed on the patient's face, peaceful despite the chaos around him, trusting in the system that was supposed to protect him. A system that had just proven it could still work when someone was brave enough to make it work. But as the surgical team wheeled him toward the operating room, Evelyn caught sight of Blackwood and Torino through the corridor windows. They hadn't left. They were making phone calls, their expressions promising that this victory would be temporary at best. The real fight was just beginning. Dr. Charlotte Webb emerged from the operating room 4 hours later, her surgical mask hanging loose around her neck, exhaustion etched in the lines around her eyes. Evelyn had been pacing the surgical waiting area, her phone clutched in her hand like a lifeline, the recording from earlier playing on loop in her mind. "He's stable," Dr. Webb said, settling into the chair beside her. "We found 3 bullet fragments, but we got them all. You made the right call pushing for immediate surgery. Another hour and we would have lost him." The relief hit Evelyn like a physical wave, but it was quickly followed by the familiar knot of anxiety that had taken up permanent residence in her stomach. "Have the police been back?" "Not yet, but—" Dr. Webb hesitated, glancing around the empty waiting room. "Evelyn, we need to talk. My office, now." The walk down the administrative corridor felt like a death march. Evelyn had been here before, called into supervisors' offices to explain why she'd filed complaints, why she'd questioned procedures, why she couldn't just keep her head down and follow orders. Each time, she'd told herself she was fighting for something important. Each time, she'd walked out unemployed or demoted. Dr. Webb's office was a study in controlled chaos, medical journals stacked on every surface, family photos sharing space with professional accolades, a coffee mug that read "World's Most Caffeinated Surgeon." It felt like a sanctuary, which made what was coming so much worse. "Sit," Dr. Webb said, closing the door behind them. "Evelyn, I've been the head of emergency surgery here for 12 years. I've seen nurses make difficult decisions under pressure, but what you did today—" "I know," Evelyn interrupted, her voice small. "I know I put you in an impossible position. If you need to fire me—" "Fire you?" Dr. Webb's eyebrows shot up. "Evelyn, you saved that man's life. You stood up to 2 detectives who were trying to pervert medical care for their own agenda. Why would I fire you for that?" The unexpected support caught Evelyn off guard. She'd been so prepared for punishment that praise felt like a foreign language. Because that's what always happens. When you stand up to the system pushes back harder. Dr. Webb studied her for a long moment. "Tell me about your brother." The words hit Evelyn like a physical blow. She'd been so careful to keep her personal life separate from work, to present herself as competent and stable despite the chaos consuming her outside these walls. "How do you?" "The detectives mentioned him, and I may have done some research after they left." Dr. Webb's voice was gentle but firm. "Marcus Reed, 26, arrested 8 months ago for armed robbery. Convicted despite an alibi that placed him 15 miles away at the time of the crime. Currently appealing his conviction while serving a 7-year sentence." Evelyn's hands began to shake. The alibi was his work schedule. He was a night security guard at a warehouse. Digital key card logs, security footage, everything documented. But the prosecutor said the timestamps could have been manipulated by an inside accomplice. And the victim identified him in a lineup. A victim who was beaten unconscious and didn't regain full consciousness for 3 days. Who initially told police the robber was at least 6 inches shorter than Marcus and had a completely different voice. Evelyn's voice cracked. But by the time of the trial, her memory had improved significantly. Dr. Webb leaned forward. "Evelyn, why didn't you tell me about this when you applied for the position? Background checks don't typically include family members' legal troubles." "Because every other hospital I applied to found reasons not to hire me once they knew. Too much baggage. Too likely to cause problems. Too—" Evelyn struggled to find the words. "Too angry at injustice to be a good employee." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither wanted to cross. Evelyn had revealed her deepest vulnerability, that she was exactly the kind of person who couldn't let things go, who couldn't accept that sometimes the system failed good people for convenience's sake. "There's something else," Dr. Webb said, pulling out a file folder. "I received a call about an hour ago from Hospital Administrator Vincent Kane. He wants to see both of us first thing tomorrow morning. Apparently, The police department has filed a formal complaint alleging that you interfered with an active investigation. The familiar sinking feeling returned to Evelyn's stomach. So this is where you tell me that my employment here is terminated pending investigation. That the hospital can't afford to be associated with controversy. Actually, Dr. Webb said, opening the folder to reveal a stack of legal documents. This is where I tell you that I've already contacted the hospital's legal department and the state medical board. What those detectives did today was a clear violation of medical ethics laws and patient rights statutes. The hospital is prepared to fight this. Evelyn stared at the documents, unable to process what she was hearing. In her experience, institutions always chose self-preservation over individual employees. Always. Why? She whispered. Why would you risk institutional conflict for someone who's been here 3 months? Dr. Webb was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the edge of a family photo that showed her with 2 young daughters. Because 15 years ago, my sister was a patient in this emergency room. She'd been beaten by her ex-boyfriend, internal bleeding, needed immediate surgery. 2 detectives convinced the attending physician to delay her treatment so they could question her first about whether she wanted to press charges. Evelyn's breath caught. She died during surgery. Complications that wouldn't have occurred if we'd operated immediately. Dr. Webb's voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly. The investigation concluded that the delay didn't contribute to her death. The detectives were commended for their thoroughness. The attending physician received a quiet reprimand and transferred to another department. Dr. Webb, I'm so sorry. My sister was 28 years old. She had twin daughters who were 3. They ask me sometimes why their mommy had to die, and I tell them it was because she was sick. But the truth is, she died because people who were supposed to protect her decided her life was less important than their convenience. The confession created an intimacy that made Evelyn's chest tight. She recognized the particular grief that came from watching someone you love be destroyed by institutional indifference. So when I saw those detectives pressure you today, Dr. Webb continued, when I saw you refuse to compromise patient care despite obvious personal risk. Evelyn, you didn't just save that patient's life. You proved that this place can still be what it's supposed to be. For the first time in months, Evelyn felt like she could breathe fully. The alliance she'd craved, the support she'd never expected, was being offered freely. What happens tomorrow? She asked. Tomorrow, we meet with Kane and tell him exactly what happened. We present evidence of the detective's misconduct. We make it clear that compromising patient care is not acceptable under any circumstances. Dr. Webb's voice carried a confidence that Evelyn envied. And we trust that doing the right thing will be enough. They were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Dr. Webb called out permission to enter, and a young man in security uniform stepped inside. Evelyn recognized him as Thomas Mueller, one of the night security guards she'd seen around the hospital but never spoken to. Dr. Webb, sorry to interrupt, Thomas said, his voice nervous. But there are 2 detectives in the lobby asking about Nurse Reed. They want to speak with her about falsifying hospital records. The blood drained from Evelyn's face. They are not done. Apparently not, Dr. Webb said grimly. Thomas, please tell the detectives that Nurse Reed is unavailable and direct them to contact hospital administration if they have concerns about our staff. Thomas shifted uncomfortably. Actually, they are not just asking. They have a warrant for her arrest. The words fell into the room like grenades. Evelyn felt the world tilt sideways as everything she'd fought for collapsed in an instant. A warrant for what charges? Dr. Webb demanded. Interfering with a police investigation, falsifying medical records, and... Thomas consulted a piece of paper, conspiracy to obstruct justice. Those are fabricated charges, Dr. Webb said, rising from her chair. Evelyn never falsified anything. She refused to falsify records. I know, but... Thomas looked directly at Evelyn, and something cold moved through his eyes. The thing is, they have security footage from the corridor showing her signing paperwork and handing it to the detectives. And they have a witness who heard her agree to delay the patient's surgery. Evelyn's world stopped spinning. That's not what happened. Thomas, you were there. You saw the whole thing. I saw you talking to the detectives, Thomas said, his voice carefully neutral. I saw you sign something and give it to them. And I heard you tell them you'd take care of the situation. The betrayal hit her like ice water. Not just the lies, but the calculated precision of them. Someone had coached Thomas on exactly what to say, exactly how to twist the truth into something that would destroy her. Thomas, Dr. Webb said, her voice deadly quiet, you're lying. I'm sorry, Dr. Webb, but I have to tell the truth. The detectives explained that Nurse Reed has a history of making false accusations against police officers. They showed me her brother's case file. They said she might try to manipulate me into backing up her story. Evelyn watched her newfound ally's face as doubt crept in. Not doubt about what had happened, but doubt about whether fighting this battle was worth the cost. The same calculation that had destroyed every other alliance she'd tried to build. Dr. Webb, Thomas continued. They also mentioned that the hospital board might look favorably on staff members who cooperate with official investigations. Especially staff members who might be eligible for promotion to head of security next month. And there it was. The price of Thomas's betrayal, offered openly like merchandise at auction. Dr. Webb looked between Thomas and Evelyn, and for a moment, the support that had felt so solid began to crack. Evelyn, I need you to understand, if there's any evidence that you actually signed something. Charlotte. Evelyn used Dr. Webb's first name deliberately, trying to bridge the distance she could feel opening between them. You know what happened. You know I didn't sign anything. I know what you told me happened. But if there's security footage, then it's been edited, fabricated, manipulated. Evelyn's voice rose with desperation. This is exactly what they did to Marcus. Create false evidence, find cooperative witnesses, make the truth look like a lie. But she could see the doubt taking hold, the institutional self-preservation instinct overwhelming personal loyalty. Dr. Webb was remembering that she had daughters to protect, a career to preserve, a position that allowed her to help people as long as she didn't risk too much. Maybe, Dr. Webb said slowly, you should consider getting a lawyer before you talk to the detectives. The suggestion felt like abandonment wrapped in practical advice. Evelyn recognized the tone, the careful retreat from alliance to neutral observation. Thomas, Dr. Webb said finally, tell the detectives that Nurse Reed will meet with them in the conference room in 10 minutes, with legal representation present. As Thomas left to deliver the message, Evelyn stared at the woman who had been her hope just minutes before. You believe them? I believe you, Dr. Webb said, but her voice lacked the conviction it had carried earlier. But Evelyn, if there's video evidence, then they manufactured it, just like they manufactured the evidence against Marcus. The silence between them was loaded with all the ways trust could be broken, all the reasons why standing up to the system was a luxury most people couldn't afford. I'll call the hospital's lawyers, Dr. Webb said. We'll figure this out. But Evelyn could hear the distance in her voice, the careful retreat from we to you. Another ally lost to the systematic pressure that made heroes too expensive to maintain. As she walked toward the conference room where the detectives waited, Evelyn realized that saving the patient's life had been the easy part. The real test was what came after, whether she could survive the consequences of doing the right thing when the entire system was designed to punish people like her. Behind her, she heard Dr. Webb making phone calls, her voice professional and distant as she explained to lawyers why the hospital needed to protect itself from potential liability. The betrayal wasn't sudden or dramatic. It was gradual and practical, which somehow made it worse. The hospital conference room felt like a courtroom designed for the condemned. Evelyn sat across from Detectives Blackwood and Torino, their lawyer, a sharp-faced woman in an expensive suit who introduced herself as District Attorney Patricia Caldwell, and Thomas Mueller, whose nervous energy filled the sterile space like toxic gas. To Evelyn's left sat the hospital's legal counsel, Michael Brennan, a man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. Behind them, Dr. Webb observed from the corner, her earlier support now wrapped in careful professional distance. Let's make this simple, DA Caldwell began, sliding a tablet across the table. Security footage from Corridor Camera 7, timestamp 2:47 p.m. Evelyn watched in horror as the screen showed a conversation that looked exactly like what had happened, except everything was wrong. In the video, she appeared calm, nodding as the detectives spoke. She could be seen taking a pen from Blackwood, signing a document, and handing it back with what looked like a cooperative smile. Audio? Brennan asked. Unfortunately, that particular camera doesn't record sound, Torino said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. But Officer Mueller here was close enough to hear the conversation. Thomas leaned forward, his voice rehearsed but convincing. Nurse Reed agreed to delay the patient's surgery. She said she understood the importance of the investigation and would do whatever was necessary to help. Evelyn stared at the young man she'd smiled at in passing for 3 months, trying to understand how he'd been turned into a weapon against her. Thomas, that's not what happened, and you know it. I know what I heard, he replied, not meeting her eyes. The document she signed, Caldwell continued, producing a hospital incident report, falsifies the timeline of the patient's condition assessment. It states that surgery was delayed due to the patient's unstable condition, not for investigative purposes. Brennan examined the document. This is Nurse Reed's signature. Evelyn looked at the paper. Her signature was there, perfect in every detail, except she'd never signed anything of the kind. This is forgery. Handwriting analysis says otherwise, Caldwell replied smoothly. Your signature, your handwriting on the medical notes. The room seemed to shrink around Evelyn as she realized the depth of the trap. They hadn't just fabricated evidence, they'd crafted a perfect case that made her look exactly like what they claimed. A nurse with a grudge against police who'd falsified records to support her narrative. However, Caldwell said, her tone shifting to something almost conciliatory, we understand that Nurse Reed has been under significant personal stress. Her brother's case, financial pressures, the trauma of recent events. Evelyn felt the setup coming like a storm front. We're prepared to offer a plea agreement. Nurse Reed pleads guilty to a misdemeanor charge of interfering with an investigation. 6 months probation, community service, and a temporary suspension of her nursing license pending completion of a psychological evaluation. And in exchange, Brennan asked, the charges against her brother get a fresh review. New evidence has come to light that might support his appeal. The offer hit Evelyn like a physical blow. They were dangling Marcus's freedom as bait, using her love for her brother as leverage to force her compliance. What new evidence? She whispered. Blackwood opened a folder and spread photos across the table. Security camera images from the night of Marcus's supposed crime, showing a figure who clearly wasn't him leaving the store. Witness statements that had been suppressed at trial. Digital records that proved the timeline couldn't possibly have worked. This evidence existed during his trial, Evelyn said, her voice shaking with rage. You had this and didn't present it. Investigations are complex, Torino said with practiced indifference. Sometimes crucial evidence gets overlooked in the initial rush to close a case. Sometimes evidence gets buried because it doesn't support the narrative you want, Evelyn shot back. Caldwell leaned forward. Miss Reed, you have exactly one chance to save your brother's life. He's not doing well in prison. Asthma attacks, harassment from other inmates who think he's a cop killer, which he isn't, of course, but perception is reality in places like that. The threat was delivered with surgical precision. Marcus was in danger, and they were the only ones who could protect him. All you have to do is admit you made a mistake today. Sign a statement saying you let your personal bias against law enforcement cloud your judgment. Take the plea, serve your probation, and your brother walks free with a full exoneration. Evelyn looked around the room at the faces watching her struggle. Brennan looked relieved at the possibility of a settlement that would protect the hospital. Dr. Webb seemed torn between her earlier conviction and the practicality of the offer. Thomas studied his hands as if they contained the secrets of the universe. And the patient, she asked. The man I supposedly delayed treatment for. Will make a full recovery, Caldwell said. Thanks to the excellent medical care he received. After I refused to delay his surgery. After you initially agreed to cooperate with our investigation, then reconsidered and did the right thing, Blackwood corrected. Your change of heart actually demonstrates your commitment to patient care over personal animosity. The revision of history was breathtaking in its audacity. They were offering to transform her act of defiance into evidence of her redemption, to make her rebellion part of their narrative of institutional cooperation. The conference room door opened, and a new figure entered, a tall man in an expensive suit whose presence immediately changed the energy in the room. Evelyn didn't recognize him, but the way everyone else straightened up suggested he was important. Vincent Kane, he said, introducing himself to the table. Hospital administrator. Sorry I'm late, I was on a call with the board of directors. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. This wasn't just about pressuring one nurse. This was about institutional control, about ensuring that individual conscience never again threatened the delicate balance of cooperation between the hospital and law enforcement. Mr. Kane, Brennan said carefully, we were just reviewing the plea offer. Which is very generous, Kane interrupted, his eyes fixed on Evelyn. Miss Reed, I want you to know that the hospital values your dedication to patient care. However, we also value our partnership with law enforcement agencies. Finding a resolution that serves everyone's interests is clearly the best path forward. Another threat, delivered with corporate polish. Accept the plea, or lose everything. Her job, her brother's freedom, her ability to help anyone ever again. But as Evelyn looked at the photos of evidence that could free Marcus, she realized something that made her blood run cold. This wasn't about justice for her brother. This was about control. They were proving they could manufacture guilt and innocence at will, that truth was whatever served their purposes. If she accepted this deal, she'd be admitting that the system worked exactly as designed, that people like her could be bought, threatened, or broken into compliance. That standing up for what was right was a luxury no one could afford. "I need to see him," she said suddenly. "See who?" Caldwell asked. "The patient. The man I supposedly falsified records about. I need to see that he's actually okay." Torino and Blackwood exchanged glances. "That's not really necessary." "It's absolutely necessary," Evelyn said, standing from her chair. "Because if I'm going to plead guilty to interfering with his care, I need to know he survived my supposed negligence." The silence in the room was deafening. Kane looked irritated, Caldwell looked calculating, and Dr. Webb looked suddenly alert. "Miss Reed," Kane said carefully, "the patient's condition is confidential." "I'm his nurse," Evelyn interrupted. "I have every right to check on his recovery." "Actually," Dr. Webb said, speaking for the first time since the meeting began, "she's correct. As the primary nurse on his case, she has legitimate medical reasons to assess his post-operative status." Evelyn caught something in Dr. Webb's tone, a careful emphasis on certain words that suggested she'd realized something important. "Fine," Caldwell said after another exchange of glances with the detectives. "But make it quick. The plea offer expires in 1 hour." As they walked toward the elevator, Dr. Webb moved close to Evelyn's side. "Room 314, she whispered. "But Evelyn, you need to know, he's not there anymore." The elevator ride felt like falling through space. When they reached the 3rd floor, Dr. Webb led her not to room 314, but to the nurse's station where a young black woman in scrubs was updating patient charts. "Janet," Dr. Webb said to the nurse, "this is Evelyn Reed. She was the primary nurse on the gunshot victim from today." Janet looked up with confusion. "What gunshot victim? We haven't had any trauma patients admitted to this floor today." The world tilted sideways. "The young black man from this afternoon. Internal bleeding, 3 bullet fragments." "Dr. Webb, there's no record of any gunshot patient being treated today," Janet said, checking her computer. "No surgeries matching that description either." Evelyn stared at the computer screen, then at Dr. Webb, understanding hitting her like ice water. "Where is he?" Dr. Webb's face had gone pale. "I don't know. After surgery, he should have been transferred here for recovery, but..." They rushed back to the surgical recovery area, where Dr. Webb pulled up the surgical logs on her computer. Evelyn watched over her shoulder as Dr. Webb scrolled through the day's procedures. No gunshot victim. No surgery for internal bleeding. No patient matching the description of the man Evelyn had fought to save. "Charlotte," Evelyn whispered, "who did we operate on?" Dr. Webb's hands trembled as she continued searching the records. "I don't understand. I remember the surgery. 4 hours, 3 bullet fragments, significant blood loss. But there was no record. No documentation. No evidence that the patient had ever existed." As understanding dawned, Evelyn realized the true scope of what they were up against. This wasn't just about falsifying one report or pressuring one nurse. This was about the complete manipulation of reality itself, the power to make people appear and disappear, to create and erase truth according to institutional needs. The patient she'd fought to save might never have existed at all. Or worse, he'd existed, but now he'd been erased so completely that even questioning his disappearance made her look delusional. Standing in the empty recovery ward, surrounded by the evidence of her own gaslight manipulation, Evelyn realized she'd reached the point of no return. She could accept the plea deal and live with the knowledge that truth was whatever power wanted it to be. Or she could fight a system that had just proven it could rewrite reality itself. The choice would define not just her future, but her very soul. The hospital parking garage at midnight felt like a tomb. Evelyn sat in her car, hands shaking as she stared at the text message that had arrived 20 minutes ago. "Meet me level 3, section C. Come alone. I have information about your patient. A friend." Every instinct screamed that this was a trap, but the alternative was accepting that she was losing her mind. That she'd hallucinated an entire patient, an entire surgery, an entire moral crisis that had upended her life. She found him leaning against a concrete pillar, a man in his early 30s with dark hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to catalog everything around him. He wore jeans and a worn leather jacket, and something about his posture suggested he was comfortable in shadows. Evelyn Reed. His voice carried a slight rasp, like someone who'd spent too many years asking difficult questions in hostile environments. Who are you? Rick Fontaine, investigative journalist with the Metro Herald. He handed her a business card, but kept his distance. I've been following Detective Blackwood and his partner for 6 months. What happened to you today fits a pattern. The relief of not being alone with this insanity was overwhelming. You believe me? About the patient. I believe that Blackwood and Torino have been systematically manipulating evidence and intimidating witnesses for years. I believe they've found ways to make inconvenient people disappear from official records. Rick's eyes were serious, but kind. What I need to know is whether you're willing to help me prove it. Evelyn studied his face, looking for the telltale signs of deception she'd learned to recognize. Why should I trust you? How do I know you're not working with them? Rick pulled out his phone and showed her a series of photographs, surveillance images of Blackwood and Torino meeting with various officials, timestamp logs, financial records. Because they've been trying to destroy my investigation for months. My editor killed my last story about them. My source at the police department was transferred to a desk job in traffic violations. And 3 weeks ago, someone broke into my apartment and stole my laptop with 2 years of research. The evidence was compelling, but Evelyn had learned to be skeptical of everything. That could all be fabricated. You're right to be cautious. Rick pocketed his phone. Here's what I know about you. Marcus Reed, your brother, was convicted of robbing a convenience store on August 15th. The timeline of his supposed crime was impossible. He was clocked into work 15 miles away when it happened. The prosecutor buried evidence that would have exonerated him. That's public record if you know where to look. This isn't. Rick's voice dropped. Marcus wasn't a random target. He was investigating something at his security job. The warehouse he guarded was being used to store evidence from closed police cases. Evidence that was supposed to have been destroyed, but was being sold to the highest bidder. Evelyn's breath caught. What kind of evidence? Drugs confiscated from dealers who were never prosecuted. Weapons that disappeared from evidence lockers. Financial records from cases that got plea bargained down to nothing. Rick moved closer, his voice urgent. Marcus found irregularities in the inventory. He was planning to report it when he was arrested. The revelation hit her like a physical blow. Marcus hadn't been an innocent victim of a flawed system. He'd been silenced for threatening to expose corruption. How do you know this? Because Marcus contacted me 2 weeks before his arrest. He wanted to give me documents proving the evidence tampering, but he never showed up to our meeting. The next day, he was in custody. Evelyn leaned against her car, overwhelmed by the implications. So the patient today was probably real. But he wasn't just a robbery victim. He was someone who knew too much, and they used your refusal to cooperate as cover to make him disappear permanently. The pieces fell into place with terrifying clarity. They hadn't just manipulated her. They'd used her conscience as a weapon against itself. We have to find him, she said. Rick shook his head. Evelyn, if I'm right about this, that patient is already dead. They kept him alive long enough to set you up, then eliminated the evidence. The casual brutality of it made her stomach lurch. So we do nothing. We do everything. But we do it smart. Rick pulled a small device from his jacket, a digital recorder. First, I need you to tell me exactly what happened today. Every word, every detail, everything you remember. For the next hour, Evelyn recounted the day's events while Rick took notes and asked probing questions. His attention was complete and focused, the kind of listening that made her feel heard rather than interrogated. The security footage they showed you, Rick said finally. You're certain it was manipulated? I never signed anything. I never agreed to delay surgery. But the video looked completely real. Because it was real. They just edited out the context and added false audio. Rick's expression was grim. It's a technique they've perfected. Take genuine footage of someone performing normal actions, then create a narrative that makes those actions look incriminating. As they talked, Evelyn found herself studying Rick's face in the dim garage lighting. There was something reassuring about his presence, a steadiness that reminded her she wasn't facing this alone. When he smiled at something she said, she caught herself responding with warmth she hadn't felt in months. There's something else, Rick said, his voice careful. The plea deal they offered you, it's not really about your brother. What do you mean? They want you to publicly admit that you falsified records due to personal bias against police. They want that confession on record, because it discredits everything you might say about what you witnessed today. The manipulation was breathtaking in its sophistication. And if I don't take the deal, they'll probably fabricate more evidence. Maybe claim you've had a psychological breakdown due to stress over your brother. Maybe arrange for you to have an accident that makes you unable to testify about anything. The threat hung between them like poison. Evelyn had entered a world where truth was malleable and conscience was a liability. Rick, why are you helping me? You don't even know me. He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant. Because 3 years ago, I watched them destroy a witness who was going to testify about police corruption. A young woman named Lisa Parker. She was going to expose a drug planting scheme, and they made her disappear too. Disappear how? Officially, she committed suicide. Jumped off a bridge after leaving a note confessing to filing false police reports. Rick's voice carried old pain. Unofficially, she called me 2 hours before she died, terrified, saying someone was following her. Were you close? We were engaged. The admission created an intimacy that made Evelyn's chest tight. She recognized the particular grief that came from losing someone to institutional violence disguised as personal tragedy. I'm sorry. Lisa died because I wasn't smart enough or fast enough to protect her. I'm not going to let that happen again. As Rick spoke, Evelyn noticed a black sedan that had been parked 3 spaces away when she arrived was now gone. In its place was a different car with tinted windows, engine running. Rick, she said quietly, we're being watched. He followed her gaze and swore under his breath. How long has that car been there? It wasn't there when we started talking. Rick grabbed her hand, the contact sending an unexpected jolt through her. We need to leave. Separately. Different directions. Wait, Evelyn said, not wanting to break the connection. How do I contact you? You don't. I'll contact you. Rick pressed a small cell phone into her palm. Burn a phone. Keep it with you at all times. And Evelyn, don't trust anyone at the hospital. Anyone. As they separated and walked toward their cars, Evelyn felt the weight of eyes on her back. The parking garage suddenly seemed full of shadows and threats, every sound potentially dangerous. She was halfway to her car when her personal phone buzzed with a text message. Your meeting was very educational. Tick-tock. B. Blackwood. They'd been watching the entire time. Before she could process the implications, another message arrived. Your brother had an incident in prison tonight. He's in the medical wing. Still breathing, but accidents happen. The threat was crystal clear. Every moment of defiance put Marcus in greater danger. As Evelyn drove home through empty streets, she caught glimpses of the sedan following at a careful distance. They weren't even trying to hide their surveillance anymore. The message was obvious. We own your world. We control your choices. We can touch anyone you care about. But Rick's presence had shifted something fundamental in her understanding of the situation. She wasn't facing this alone, and she wasn't going crazy. There was a larger pattern of corruption, and she was just the latest target. The question was whether knowledge would be enough to save her, or if understanding the system would only make her destruction more efficient. As she pulled into her apartment complex, Evelyn noticed lights on in her unit. Lights she was certain she'd turned off before leaving for work 14 hours ago. Someone had been inside her home. The burner phone Rick had given her felt like a lifeline as she sat in her car, trying to decide whether to call the police, who might be part of the problem, or go inside and face whatever was waiting for her. The sedan that had followed her pulled into the parking space directly across from her apartment and turned off its lights, making it clear that running wasn't an option. She was trapped between the unknown threat inside her home and the known threat watching from the shadows. As she reached for the burner phone to call Rick, her personal phone rang. The caller ID made her blood freeze. Marcus's prison. They never called this late unless something was seriously wrong. Miss Reed. The voice was professional but strained. This is Warden Thompson at State Correctional. I'm calling about your brother. The parking lot felt like it was spinning around her. Is he alive? He's stable, but there was an incident. He was attacked by other inmates. Severe beating, broken ribs, punctured lung. The warden's voice carried something that might have been sympathy. Miss Reed, I have to ask, has your brother been involved in anything that might make him a target? The question was a trap wrapped in concern. If she said yes, she'd be admitting Marcus was somehow responsible for his own victimization. If she said no, she'd be lying about the investigation that had put him in danger in the first place. Can I see him? Visiting hours are suspended while we investigate the incident. But Miss Reed, off the record, Your brother might be safer if certain legal matters involving him were resolved quickly. Prison can be a dangerous place for people who've drawn the wrong kind of attention. Another threat, delivered with bureaucratic politeness. As she hung up, Evelyn realized the full scope of the pressure being applied. They could hurt Marcus whenever they chose. They could enter her home at will. They could manipulate evidence, create false witnesses, and make people disappear from reality itself. But they'd also revealed something crucial. They were worried enough about what she might do to escalate their tactics. That meant her defiance had power, even if she couldn't see it yet. The lights in her apartment seemed to flicker as she watched, as if whoever was inside was signaling her. An invitation or a threat, or both. Evelyn looked at the burner phone in her hand, then at the sedan watching her every move. Tomorrow, she would have to decide whether to take the plea deal that would save Marcus but destroy her soul, or continue fighting a system that had infinite resources and no moral constraints. Tonight, she had to survive whatever was waiting inside her home. As she walked toward her apartment building, Evelyn realized that Rick Fontaine had given her something more valuable than information or a phone number. He'd given her the knowledge that someone else understood the stakes and was willing to share the risk. In a world where truth was whatever power wanted it to be, that alliance might be the only real thing left. The question was whether it would be enough to save both her and Marcus from a system designed to destroy anyone who refused to submit. Evelyn's apartment had been ransacked with surgical precision. Nothing was destroyed, but everything had been touched. Drawers pulled out exactly 3 inches. Books moved slightly out of alignment. Her laptop gone, but her coffee mug left perfectly centered on the kitchen counter with a note underneath. Nice meeting tonight. Sweet dreams. Your new friends. The violation was intimate and calculated, designed to make her feel helpless rather than angry. They wanted her to know that privacy was an illusion, that safety was something they could revoke at will. The burner phone Rick had given her buzzed with a text. Are you safe? Can you talk? She dialed the number, desperate for the sound of a friendly voice in the violated space of her home. Evelyn. Thank God. I was worried when I saw them follow you. Rick's voice carried genuine concern that made her chest warm despite everything. They were in my apartment. They took my laptop, left a note. Her voice cracked. And Marcus was attacked in prison tonight. Broken ribs, punctured lung. Jesus. Evelyn, this is escalating faster than I expected. You can't stay there tonight. Where am I supposed to go? They are watching everything. There's a motel on Route 42, about 15 miles west. The Pineview Motor Lodge. Pay cash, register under a false name. I'll meet you there in an hour. The prospect of seeing Rick again sent an unexpected flutter through her stomach. In the middle of this nightmare, he represented something real and human. Someone who saw her as more than a problem to be solved or a threat to be neutralized. Rick, how do I know this isn't part of their game? The pause on the other end was just long enough to make her doubt herself. Because if I was working for them, you'd already be dead. The brutal honesty was somehow reassuring. Evelyn grabbed a bag, threw in essential items, and left through the building's service exit. As she drove toward the motel, she noticed the sedan following at a distance, not trying to stop her, just making sure she knew she was monitored. The Pineview Motor Lodge looked like it had been built in the 1970s and abandoned sometime in the 1990s. Flickering neon signs advertised clean rooms and cable TV to an empty parking lot. Evelyn paid the desk clerk, a tired-looking woman with suspicious eyes, for 2 nights and took the key to room 23. Rick arrived 20 minutes later, carrying coffee and sandwiches from a 24-hour diner. When he smiled at her through the door's security chain, Evelyn felt something loosen in her chest. The relief of not being alone was overwhelming. You look exhausted, he said, setting the food on the small table by the window. I look like someone whose life has been turned inside out in 12 hours. But she found herself smiling back at him. Thank you for this. For helping me. As they ate, Rick asked detailed questions about the break-in, taking notes on everything she remembered. His attention was complete and focused, and Evelyn found herself watching the way his eyes crinkled when he concentrated, the way his hands moved when he gestured. Rick, she said during a pause in their debriefing, why are you really doing this? And don't say it's just about Lisa. He was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. Because you remind me that some people still can't be bought or intimidated. Because when you stood up to those detectives today, you did something I've been too afraid to do for 3 years. What do you mean? I mean I've been investigating corruption, writing stories that get killed, collecting evidence that disappears. But I've never put myself on the line the way you did today. Rick moved closer to her on the motel room's small couch. You risked everything for someone you didn't even know. That's extraordinary. The admiration in his voice made her feel exposed and powerful at the same time. When he reached up to touch her face, she didn't pull away. Evelyn, he said softly, I haven't felt anything like this since Lisa died. I didn't think I could. The kiss that followed was gentle at first, then desperate, two people clinging to something real in a world that had become hostile and unpredictable. When they broke apart, Evelyn could see her own need reflected in his eyes. This is crazy, she whispered. Everything is falling apart, and I'm... You what? I'm falling for someone I met 6 hours ago in a parking garage while running from corrupt cops. Rick laughed, and the sound was warm and genuine. When you put it like that, it does sound insane. They made love with the intensity of people who understood that tomorrow might bring irreversible disaster. Afterward, lying in the dark motel room with Rick's arm around her, Evelyn felt peaceful for the first time in months. What happens now? She asked. Now we build a case that's too big for them to cover up. We find other victims, other witnesses. We make this story too public to suppress. And Marcus? Rick's arm tightened around her. We save him too. I promise. It was the promise that made her finally relax enough to sleep. Evelyn woke at dawn to find Rick sitting by the window, fully dressed, speaking quietly into his phone. She lay still, listening to fragments of conversation that made her blood run cold. She's exactly where we need her, emotional connection is established. Yes, sir, she trusts me completely. Rick ended the call and turned to find her watching him. The expression on his face shifted from professional calculation to something that might have been regret. You're awake, he said. Who were you talking to? The pause lasted just a heartbeat too long. My editor. I was updating him on the story. But Evelyn had heard enough journalism calls to know the difference between reporting to an editor and receiving instructions from a handler. The realization hit her like ice water. Rick, she said carefully, show me your press credentials. Evelyn, why are you? Show me your credentials. Your business card. Something that proves you work for the Metro Herald. Rick's face went perfectly still. You don't trust me. I trusted you completely. That's the problem. Evelyn sat up, pulling the sheet around herself. The timing of your appearance, the way you knew exactly what to say, the perfect safe house. The pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. You're working for them. It's not that simple. Yes or no, Rick? Are you working for Blackwood and Torino? The silence that followed was answer enough. My God, Evelyn breathed. Last night, was that part of the job too? No. Rick's voice was sharp with something that sounded like pain. Last night was real. Everything I felt, that was real. But you're still going to betray me. Rick stood and walked to the window, his back to her. Evelyn, you have no idea how deep this goes. The corruption isn't just a few bad cops. It's systematic. It goes all the way up to the mayor's office, the district attorney, the hospital board. So you decided to join them. I decided to survive. Rick turned back to her, and she could see genuine anguish in his eyes. 3 years ago, I was like you. I thought individual conscience could change institutional corruption. I thought the truth mattered more than power. What happened? They killed Lisa. Not just metaphorically, they actually murdered her and made it look like suicide. And then they came for me. Rick's voice was hollow. They gave me a choice, work for them, or join her. The revelation recontextualized everything. Rick wasn't a heartless manipulator. He was another victim, broken and turned into a weapon against people like himself. So the investigation you told me about was real, until they destroyed it and recruited me to prevent others from doing the same thing. Rick sat on the edge of the bed, careful not to touch her. Evelyn, I've been watching you since your brother was arrested. I know everything about your life, your finances, your psychological profile. I was supposed to approach you after the incident with the detectives and gain your trust. Then what? Then convince you to take the plea deal. Make you believe that fighting was hopeless, that your only option was surrender. The manipulation was breathtaking in its sophistication. They hadn't just threatened her, they'd given her hope, then used that hope as leverage to break her completely. But something went wrong, she said. You went wrong. Rick's voice was soft. You were supposed to be a victim I could manipulate. Instead, you were. He struggled for words. You were everything I used to believe in. Everything I'd forgotten was possible. Evelyn pulled her knees to her chest, trying to process the depth of the betrayal. So last night was what? A moment of conscience before you destroy me. Last night was me remembering who I used to be before they turned me into this. Rick reached toward her, then stopped himself. Evelyn, I can't undo what I've done. But I can tell you what they are planning. Which is? Today, they are going to arrest you on federal charges. Conspiracy to obstruct justice, making false statements to federal agents, interfering with a terrorism investigation. Terrorism. They are going to claim the patient you defended was a suspected terrorist, and that your refusal to cooperate compromised national security. Rick's expression was grim. Federal charges mean federal prison. No bail, no local media coverage, no chance for public sympathy. The scope of the trap was overwhelming. They'd used her own conscience to manipulate her into a position where any choice she made would destroy her. And Marcus will die in prison. They'll make it look like gang violence or suicide, but he'll be dead within a week. The casual brutality of it made her stomach lurch. Unless I take the plea deal. The offer expires at noon today. After that, you disappear into the federal system and your brother dies anyway. Evelyn stared at Rick, trying to reconcile the man who'd made love to her with the man who'd been sent to destroy her. Why are you telling me this? Because last night, you reminded me that some things are worth dying for. Rick's voice was barely a whisper. And because I'd rather die as the person I used to be than live as the person they've made me become. The motel room felt like a confession booth where souls were weighed and found wanting. Outside, Evelyn could hear cars arriving in the parking lot, the sound of her world closing in. They are here, Rick said, looking through the window blinds. You called them. I was supposed to. But Evelyn, there's something else. Something they don't know I know. Rick pulled a small flash drive from his pocket. The patient from yesterday? He's not dead. They are holding him at a black site warehouse on the industrial side of town. And he's not a robbery suspect or a terrorist. What is he? He's a federal prosecutor who was investigating the evidence tampering ring. The same investigation your brother stumbled into. Rick pressed the flash drive into her palm. This contains everything: financial records, personnel files, communications between corrupt officials. Everything I've been collecting for 3 years. The weight of the device felt like holding dynamite. Rick, if this is real, it's real. And it's your only chance to save Marcus and expose what they've done. Rick moved toward the door. But you have to decide right now. Take the drive and run, or take the plea deal and let them win. Through the window, Evelyn could see federal agents surrounding the building. Black SUVs, tactical gear, the full intimidation theater designed to make resistance look impossible. Where do I go? There's a journalist in Chicago, Amanda Walsh with the Tribune. She's been investigating federal corruption cases. If you can get this to her. Rick's voice trailed off as car doors slammed outside. What about you? Rick smiled, and for the first time since she'd known him, it looked completely genuine. I'm going to do what I should have done 3 years ago when they killed Lisa. I'm going to tell the truth. As federal agents pounded on the motel room door, Rick kissed her one last time. I'm sorry, Evelyn. For all of it. But not for last night. Rick. The bathroom window. There's a drainage ditch behind the building that leads to the highway. You have maybe 60 seconds. The door exploded inward as Evelyn clutched the flash drive and ran toward the bathroom. Behind her, she heard Rick's voice, calm and clear. Agent Patterson? Rick Fontaine, Metro Herald. I have information about systematic corruption in your department that you're going to want to hear. As she squeezed through the bathroom window, Evelyn realized that Rick's betrayal had transformed into the most complete act of redemption she'd ever witnessed. He was sacrificing himself to give her a chance to save Marcus and expose the conspiracy that had destroyed both their lives. The drainage ditch was cold and muddy, but it led away from the motel toward a cluster of abandoned buildings. As she crawled through the concrete tunnel, Evelyn could hear gunshots from the direction of the motel, 3 quick pops that made her stomach clench. When she emerged from the ditch, the silence told her everything she needed to know. Rick Fontaine had been shot while resisting arrest, or while trying to escape, or for whatever reason would look plausible in the official report. The man who had betrayed her trust had died restoring it. Standing in the abandoned parking lot with nothing but the clothes on her back and a flash drive containing evidence that could topple a conspiracy, Evelyn realized she was completely alone. Dr. Webb had retreated into institutional self-preservation. Rick was dead. Marcus was trapped in a prison where guards could claim he died for any number of believable reasons. But she was alive, and she had proof of crimes that went far beyond anything she'd imagined. The question was whether one nurse with no resources and no allies could expose a conspiracy that included federal agents, police detectives, hospital administrators, and prosecutors. As sirens wailed in the distance, Evelyn started walking toward the highway, clutching the flash drive that might be her brother's only chance for survival, or her own death warrant. For the first time since this nightmare began, she was completely free to choose her own path. The question was whether freedom would be enough to save the people she loved, or if she would simply die as a free person instead of living as a compliant one. Chicago was 300 miles away, and the most powerful people in the city wanted her dead or silent. But Rick had died believing she could make it, and that faith felt like a sacred trust she couldn't betray. The truck driver who picked up Evelyn outside Millfield was a weathered man named Frank who asked no questions when she said she needed to get to Chicago and had no money for a bus ticket. He was hauling furniture to a warehouse on the south side, and the 12-hour drive gave her time to think, which turned out to be a curse rather than a blessing. Every mile that passed brought new waves of grief over Rick's death and terror over Marcus's situation. She'd called the prison from a gas station payphone, only to be told that her brother had been moved to solitary confinement for his own protection, and that all visits were suspended indefinitely. The flash drive felt like it was burning a hole in her pocket. She tried to examine its contents on Frank's dashboard tablet while he slept at a rest stop, but the files were encrypted and password protected. Without access to the evidence, she was just another fugitive with a wild story about conspiracy and corruption. "You running from someone?" Frank asked as they entered Chicago's sprawling suburbs. "Something like that. My daughter ran from her ex-husband for 2 years, Frank said, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. Kept thinking if she just got far enough away, he'd forget about her. But men like that, they got long memories and longer reach." The observation hit closer to home than Evelyn wanted to admit. Even if she reached Amanda Walsh, even if the journalist believed her story, Blackwood and his network had proven they could manipulate federal agencies. What made her think a newspaper article would be enough to stop them? Frank dropped her off at Union Station, pressing a $20 bill into her hand despite her protests. "Get yourself something to eat," he said. "And kid, whatever you're running from, don't run so hard you forget why you started." The Chicago Tribune building was a monument to the golden age of journalism, all glass and steel reaching toward a sky that looked like it might collapse at any moment. Evelyn stood across the street, watching people flow in and out of the lobby, and tried to summon the courage to walk through those doors. Her reflection in a storefront window showed the truth. She looked like exactly what she was. A desperate woman who'd been sleeping in truck stops and gas station bathrooms, whose story sounded like the paranoid delusions of someone in the middle of a psychological breakdown. The burner phone Rick had given her rang, and for a wild moment she thought it might be him. That somehow he'd survived, that this nightmare might have one less terrible ending. But the caller ID showed only numbers. Evelyn Reed. The voice was familiar but wrong. Detective Torino, somehow calling from Rick's supposedly secure line. "How did you get this number?" "The same way we got everything else about your boyfriend. Did you really think we didn't know he was feeding you information?" Torino's voice carried smug satisfaction. "Rick Fontaine wasn't a journalist, sweetheart. He was a federal informant who'd been working undercover in corruption cases for 3 years." The words hit her like ice water. "You're lying. Check the obituaries, Evelyn. See what they say about Rick's real name and occupation." There was a pause filled with traffic noise. Special Agent Richard Fontaine, FBI, killed in the line of duty while pursuing a fugitive suspected of federal crimes. Evelyn's legs gave out, and she sat down hard on the sidewalk. Passers-by stepped around her with the practiced indifference of city dwellers avoiding human wreckage. "The flash drive he gave you," Torino continued, "encrypted with federal codes that will lead us right to you the moment you try to access it. Smart boy, our Rick. Even his betrayal served our purposes. He died trying to help me. He died because he forgot which side he was on. But don't worry, we'll make sure his sacrifice wasn't in vain. We'll find you, we'll recover the evidence he stole, and we'll make sure you join him." The call ended, leaving Evelyn sitting on a Chicago sidewalk with the full weight of her isolation crushing down on her. Rick hadn't just betrayed her trust, he'd been lying about his very identity. The federal informant who'd made her fall in love with him had stolen evidence and used her as cover for his own rebellion against his handlers. Even his redemption had been built on deception. The Tribune building suddenly looked less like salvation and more like another trap. If the flash drive was tracked, if Rick had been a federal agent, then Amanda Walsh might already be compromised. Walking through those doors could be walking into federal custody. But Marcus was still in prison, still in danger, still counting on her to save him even though he didn't know she was trying. Evelyn forced herself to stand and cross the street. The lobby was all marble and brass, designed to intimidate and impress in equal measure. The security guard at the reception desk looked like an ex-cop, and his eyes tracked her with professional suspicion. "I need to see Amanda Walsh," she said. "It's about a story she's been investigating." "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but..." "Then you need to call and schedule one. Ms. Walsh doesn't see walk-ins." The rejection felt like another door slamming in her face. Evelyn was about to argue when a woman's voice cut through the lobby noise. "Evelyn Reed." She turned to see a tall black woman in an expensive suit approaching from the elevator bank. Mid-40s, intelligent eyes, the kind of presence that suggested she was accustomed to being the smartest person in most rooms. "I'm Amanda Walsh. We need to talk." Relief flooded through Evelyn like warm water. "Thank God. I have evidence about federal corruption, about systematic." "Not here." Amanda's voice was sharp. "Follow me." They rode the elevator to the 20th floor in silence, Amanda's expression unreadable. Her office was a journalist's chaos, documents stacked everywhere, whiteboards covered with names and connections, photos of politicians and officials connected by red string like a conspiracy theorist's fever dream. "Sit," Amanda said, closing the door behind them. "Now tell me why a federal fugitive wanted for obstruction of justice is standing in my office." The question felt like a trap. "How do you know I'm wanted?" "Because Agent Patterson called me an hour ago asking if I'd heard from you. Because your photo is being circulated to law enforcement agencies across 3 states. Because Rick Fontaine, who was one of my best sources, died this morning trying to help you escape federal custody." Evelyn stared at the woman she'd hoped would be her salvation. "You knew Rick was FBI." "I knew he was feeding me information about corruption cases. I didn't ask too many questions about how he got access to that information." Amanda moved to her window, looking out at the city below. "What I want to know is why he died for you." "Because he found evidence of systematic corruption. Police, prosecutors, federal agents, all working together to manipulate cases, eliminate witnesses, control outcomes." Evelyn pulled out the flash drive. "It's all on here." Amanda turned back to her, and something cold moved through her eyes. "Show me." Evelyn inserted the drive into Amanda's computer, then watched in horror as a tracking program immediately launched. Within seconds, a map appeared showing their exact location, with red dots converging on the building from multiple directions. "You brought them right to me," Amanda said, her voice deadly quiet. "I didn't know. Rick said you could help." "Rick was trying to get himself and his evidence to safety. You were just the delivery system." Amanda was already moving, pulling files from her desk and shoving them into a bag. "Federal agents will be here in 5 minutes. They'll arrest you, confiscate the drive, and classify everything on it as national security information. Then we copy it. We get the information out before they arrive." Amanda laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Evelyn, you sweet, naive child. Do you think this is the first time someone's tried to expose this particular conspiracy?" She pulled out a thick folder and spread photos across her desk. Crime scenes, accident reports, suicide notes, all featuring people who looked like they'd been living normal lives until they weren't. 12 journalists over the past 5 years. All investigating aspects of the same corruption network. All dead from suicides, accidents, or random crimes. Amanda's finger traced from photo to photo. The pattern is perfect because they don't try to hide it anymore. They want people to know what happens to anyone who threatens the system. Evelyn stared at the photos, recognizing the particular horror of institutional murder disguised as personal tragedy. "So you're giving up?" "I'm surviving. Just like you should do." Amanda deleted files from her computer with practiced efficiency. "Take the plea deal, Evelyn. Serve your time, keep your mouth shut, and maybe you'll live long enough to see your brother again." "My brother will be dead within a week. Then he'll be dead whether you fight or surrender. The only question is whether you'll die with him." The brutal pragmatism felt like being slapped. Evelyn had expected an ally and found another person too afraid to fight, too worn down by systematic oppression to believe resistance was possible. "There has to be something," she said desperately. "Some way to expose this." Amanda stopped deleting files and looked at her with something that might have been pity. You know what the real tragedy is? Rick actually thought you were different. He thought you might be strong enough to do what all the rest of us couldn't. What's that? Die for the truth instead of living with lies. The words hit Evelyn like physical blows. Everyone she'd turned to for help had eventually revealed the same fundamental brokenness. The knowledge that the system was too powerful, too all-encompassing, too willing to use unlimited violence to maintain control. Dr. Webb had retreated into institutional loyalty. Rick had died trying to redeem years of compromise. Amanda had given up hope entirely. And Marcus was still in prison, still in danger, still counting on a sister who was running out of options and allies. Through Amanda's office window, Evelyn could see black SUVs pulling up to the building. Federal agents in tactical gear were already entering the lobby. There's a service elevator behind the break room, Amanda said, shouldering her bag. Takes you to the parking garage. You've got maybe 3 minutes. Where will you go? Somewhere far from here. And Evelyn, if they catch you, don't mention my name. I've got kids to protect. Another abandonment, wrapped in the practical necessity of survival. As Evelyn ran toward the service elevator, she realized she'd reached the bottom of her resources. No more allies, no more plans, no more hope that institutional justice could be made to work. The elevator descended through the building like a coffin dropping into the earth. When the doors opened in the parking garage, Evelyn found herself alone in the concrete darkness, clutching a flash drive that was both evidence of massive corruption and a tracking beacon leading her enemies directly to her. Above her, she could hear the sounds of federal agents searching the building. Soon they would realize she'd escaped, and the manhunt would expand across the entire city. Marcus would die in prison. Rick's sacrifice would be meaningless. The conspiracy would continue destroying lives with impunity, and she would either be captured and disappeared, or spend the rest of her life running from people with unlimited resources and no moral constraints. Standing in the garage darkness, Evelyn realized she'd finally found the bottom of despair. The place where hope goes to die, where individual conscience confronts institutional power and discovers just how powerless it truly is. For the first time since this nightmare began, she understood why so many people chose to surrender rather than fight. The question was whether understanding would give her strength or finally break her completely. The parking garage felt like a tomb, but Evelyn forced herself to move through the concrete maze of support pillars and parked cars. Every footstep echoed in the darkness, and she could hear the distant sound of elevator doors opening as federal agents began their systematic search. She found an exit ramp that led to a side street, but as she approached the daylight, her burner phone rang again. This time, the caller ID showed a number she recognized. The prison. Miss Reed. The voice belonged to Warden Thompson, but something was wrong. He sounded strained, almost frightened. I need you to listen very carefully. Your brother is in immediate danger. Evelyn pressed herself against the concrete wall, hidden in the shadows of the exit ramp. What kind of danger? There's been pressure from federal authorities to transfer Marcus to a maximum security facility. Tonight, the transfer paperwork claims he's been reclassified as a terrorism threat. The words hit her like ice water. She knew what happened to people labeled as terrorism threats in maximum security federal prisons. They disappeared into administrative segregation and died from medical complications or suicide within weeks. Warden Thompson, you can't let them. Miss Reed, I've been running this prison for 15 years. I know what a legitimate federal transfer looks like, and this isn't it. His voice dropped to a whisper. Someone very powerful wants your brother dead, and they're using federal resources to make it happen. Through the garage entrance, Evelyn could see black SUVs blocking every street exit. The federal dragnet was tightening around the building. What can you do to stop it? Nothing. Unless. The warden paused. There might be one way. If Marcus voluntarily entered protective custody based on credible threats to his safety, I could delay the transfer pending a formal review. How long would that buy us? Maybe 48 hours. But Miss Reed, I need you to understand. I'm risking my career and my pension doing this. If federal authorities discover I'm obstructing their transfer order, another good person being forced to choose between doing right and protecting themselves. Evelyn was beginning to understand that the system's real power wasn't violence. It was the way it made everyone complicit in their own oppression. What do you need from me? A signed statement from you alleging that your brother has received specific death threats related to his case. Something credible enough to justify protective custody. Evelyn closed her eyes, recognizing the trap within the favor. If I sign that statement, I have to come to the prison. In person. The law requires notarized documentation for protective custody requests. I'm sorry, but yes. And federal agents are monitoring all traffic to the prison. The silence on the other end confirmed what she already knew. Going to save Marcus would mean walking directly into federal custody. She'd be arrested before she reached the prison gates. There's something else, Warden Thompson said quietly. Your brother asked me to give you a message. He said to tell you that he knows what you've been trying to do, and is proud of you. But he wants you to know that he'd rather die free than live knowing you sacrificed yourself for him. The message was pure Marcus, noble, self-sacrificing, and completely missing the point. Evelyn hadn't been fighting to save him from prison. She'd been fighting to save him from a system that turned innocent people into expendable casualties. Warden, if I don't come. Then he dies tonight during the transfer. I'm sorry, Miss Reed, but those are the only options. As the call ended, Evelyn realized she'd reached the moment every hero faces in every story. The impossible choice between self-preservation and sacrifice. But this wasn't a story where noble sacrifice led to redemption. This was reality, where good people died for nothing and systems continued functioning regardless of individual conscience. The burner phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Evelyn, this is Dr. Webb. I need to see you immediately. I have information about the patient from yesterday. Meet me at St. Mary's Hospital, emergency entrance. Come alone. Another choice, another potential trap. Dr. Webb had already proven she'd retreat into institutional safety when pressured. But she was also the only person who'd seen the mysterious patient firsthand. Evelyn looked at the flash drive in her hand. The evidence that Rick had died to give her, the proof that could expose massive corruption if she could find someone brave enough to publish it. Then she thought about Marcus, alone in a prison cell, counting down the hours until federal agents arrived to transfer him to his death. Every option led to disaster. Save Marcus and get arrested before she could expose the conspiracy. Pursue the evidence and let her brother die. Trust Dr. Webb and walk into another trap. Run away and abandon everyone who'd sacrificed for her. The parking garage exit led to a street where federal agents waited. But the emergency stairwell led back into the building, where she could potentially access Amanda's computer system and try to transmit the evidence before being captured. Or she could surrender. Walk out with her hands up, take whatever deal they offered, and hope that compliance would at least keep Marcus alive long enough for someone else to fight this battle. The burner phone rang again. This time, the caller ID made her stomach clench. Detective Blackwood. Hello, Evelyn. Having a productive day. Go to hell. Actually, I'm in the Tribune building lobby. 20th floor, to be specific. Amanda Walsh's office. Blackwood's voice carried casual menace. Interesting woman. Very dedicated to her children. Twin daughters, age 7. Adorable little girls. The threat was crystal clear, delivered with the practiced ease of someone who'd made similar calls many times before. Leave them alone. That depends entirely on you. See, we have a problem. You have something that belongs to us, and you've caused considerable trouble trying to give it away. There was a pause filled with office sounds. But we're reasonable people. We're prepared to make a deal. What kind of deal? You come up to the 20th floor, hands visible, and surrender the flash drive. In exchange, your brother gets transferred to a minimum security facility where he'll serve out his sentence in relative comfort. Ms. Walsh's daughters get to grow up with their mother. And you get to disappear into federal custody where you'll be treated humanely. Disappear forever, you mean. Disappear safely. There's a difference. Blackwood's tone became almost conversational. Evelyn, you've caused us considerable expense and embarrassment. Normally, that would result in severe consequences. But we recognize that you were manipulated by a rogue federal agent who fed you false information. Even in surrender, they were rewriting history to fit their narrative. What about the conspiracy? The evidence of corruption will be properly investigated by appropriate federal authorities. Some people will be quietly transferred or retired. Some policies will be adjusted. Justice will be served in the way that best protects national security. In other words, nothing would change except that the current crisis would be contained. You have 30 seconds to decide, Blackwood continued. Come up and surrender, or Ms. Walsh's daughters become orphans and your brother dies screaming in a federal black site. The ultimatum hung in the air like poison gas. Evelyn could hear elevator doors opening above her, federal agents expanding their search to the parking garage. She thought about Rick, dying to give her evidence that was designed to lead her enemies directly to her. About Amanda, abandoning the fight to protect her children. About Dr. Webb, calling her to a meeting that was probably another trap. About Marcus, sitting in a prison cell, believing his sister was strong enough to save him. Every person who'd tried to help her had been broken by the same system she was fighting. Every alliance had crumbled under pressure. Every act of resistance had been absorbed and neutralized by institutional power. But as federal agents fanned out through the parking garage, their flashlight beams cutting through the darkness like searchlights hunting escaped prisoners, Evelyn realized something that changed everything. She was going to die. Whether she surrendered or fought, whether she saved Marcus or exposed the conspiracy, she was going to die. The system couldn't allow someone who knew this much to live, regardless of what deals they offered. The only real choice was how she would die, as someone who'd surrendered to evil, or as someone who'd fought it until the end. And if she was going to die anyway, then she could make choices based on principle rather than survival. Evelyn looked at the flash drive one more time, then at the emergency stairwell that led back into the building. Somewhere in that building was a computer system connected to the internet. Somewhere out there were journalists and activists and ordinary people who deserved to know the truth. Marcus would want her to fight, even if it meant letting him die. Rick had died believing she was strong enough to do what others couldn't. Even Amanda, in her cynicism, had preserved evidence because some part of her still believed truth mattered. The choice wasn't between saving Marcus and exposing the conspiracy. The choice was between dying as a victim or dying as someone who'd refused to surrender. "Blackwood," she said into the phone, "I have a counteroffer. You're not in a position to negotiate." "Actually, I am. Because in about 60 seconds, I'm going to upload everything on this drive to every major news outlet, social media platform, and government watchdog organization in the country. And there's nothing you can do to stop me." The silence on the other end was loaded with rage and calculation. "Your brother will die." "My brother is already dead. You were never going to let him live." Evelyn started walking toward the emergency stairwell. "But his death will mean something when the world knows why he was really in prison. Ms. Walsh's children will grow up in a world where people know that journalists who investigate corruption get murdered by federal agents. Maybe that knowledge will make the next conspiracy harder to maintain." As she climbed the emergency stairs, Evelyn could hear chaos erupting throughout the building. Shouts, running feet, radio chatter as federal agents realized their prisoner was no longer contained. She reached the 15th floor and found an unlocked office with a computer terminal. Her hands shook as she inserted the flash drive and began uploading files to every destination she could think of: news outlets, civil rights organizations, social media platforms, government transparency websites. The upload progress bar crawled forward with agonizing slowness: 23%, 31%, 45%. Below her, she could hear boots pounding up the emergency stairwell. Federal agents shouting orders, coordinating their search. 52%, 67%, 78%. The office door exploded inward as tactical agents flooded into the room, weapons drawn, voices screaming commands that blended into white noise. 89%, 94%, 97%. Detective Blackwood appeared in the doorway, his face twisted with rage. "Stop the upload or we start killing people." 98%, 99%. Upload complete. Evelyn turned away from the computer to face the weapons pointed at her. She thought about Marcus, probably sitting in his cell wondering why his sister hadn't come to save him. About Rick, dying to give her information that had finally found its way into the world. About Dr. Webb and Amanda and all the other people who'd been forced to choose between courage and survival. "It's done," she said quietly. The first gunshot came from somewhere behind Blackwood, followed immediately by two more. Evelyn felt the impacts like hammer blows, driving her to her knees as the office filled with smoke and shouting. As consciousness faded, she could hear the faint sound of notification alerts from her phone. Messages from news outlets, confirmation emails, automatic responses indicating that her upload had been received and distributed. The truth was out there now, spreading through digital networks faster than any conspiracy could contain it. Marcus would die. She would die. But the system that had destroyed them would be exposed for what it was. In the growing darkness, Evelyn smiled. Sometimes dying free was the most powerful choice of all. Evelyn woke in a hospital bed, her body wrapped in bandages, machines beeping steadily around her. For a moment, she thought she was back in her own emergency room, that everything had been a nightmare. Then she saw the handcuffs securing her wrist to the bed rail and remembered. She was a federal prisoner recovering from gunshot wounds. "You're awake." Dr. Charlotte Webb's voice came from the corner of the room, but she looked different. More alert, more purposeful than Evelyn remembered. "Charlotte." Evelyn's voice was barely a whisper. "What are you doing here?" "Keeping you alive." Dr. Webb moved closer, checking Evelyn's vital signs with professional precision. "You've been unconscious for 36 hours. 3 gunshot wounds, but miraculously, all of them missed vital organs." Miraculously. Dr. Webb's smile was small but significant. Federal agents aren't typically known for their poor marksmanship. Unless, of course, they are aiming to wound rather than kill. The implication took a moment to penetrate Evelyn's medication-fogged brain. "You're saying they missed on purpose?" "I'm saying that Agent Patterson, the lead federal agent on your case, has been feeding information to journalists for 6 months. I'm saying that Detective Blackwood's investigation has been under federal surveillance the entire time. And I'm saying that your upload didn't just expose a local corruption ring, it provided the final piece of evidence needed to bring down a criminal conspiracy that reaches into the highest levels of government." Evelyn stared at Dr. Webb, trying to process information that seemed too good to be true. "I don't understand." Dr. Webb pulled up a chair and leaned forward. "Do you remember the patient from that first day? The young black man you fought to save? The one who disappeared from all records? His name is James Washington. He's not a robbery suspect or a terrorism threat." Dr. Webb's voice carried quiet intensity. "He's a federal prosecutor who's been building a racketeering case against corrupt law enforcement officials for 3 years. The same case your brother stumbled into at his warehouse job." The revelation hit Evelyn like electricity. Marcus knew about the federal investigation. Marcus was feeding information to federal investigators through his job. The evidence tampering at the warehouse wasn't random corruption. It was systematic destruction of evidence in cases where prosecutors like James Washington were building larger conspiracy charges. Dr. Webb pulled out a tablet and showed Evelyn news headlines scrolling across the screen. "Federal corruption conspiracy exposed. Massive police cover-up revealed. Hospital administrator arrested in racketeering scheme." Your upload provided the final evidence needed to activate arrests that had been planned for months. Vincent Kane, the hospital administrator, was taken into custody this morning. District Attorney Patricia Caldwell is facing federal charges. Detective Blackwood and Torino are in federal custody. Evelyn felt dizzy, and not just from the medications. "But Rick said." "Rick told you what he had to tell you to keep you moving in the right direction." Dr. Webb's expression was gentle but firm. Special Agent Richard Fontaine was deep undercover, tasked with gaining the trust of corruption targets. His relationship with you was supposed to be professional manipulation. Supposed to be. But he fell in love with you for real. And when he realized that exposing the conspiracy would require your testimony that would put you in mortal danger, he decided to sacrifice his cover and his life to protect you. The room seemed to spin around Evelyn as she tried to reconcile everything she thought she knew with this new information. "So when he gave me the flash drive, he was ensuring that the evidence would reach federal investigators through a route that couldn't be suppressed or controlled by the conspiracy. Your upload bypassed every institutional filter and made the information impossible to contain." Dr. Webb stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. "Evelyn, there's something else you need to know. About that first day, when I told you about my sister." "What about it?" "My sister didn't die from delayed medical care 15 years ago." Dr. Webb turned back to her, and Evelyn could see tears in her eyes. "She died 6 months ago, murdered by the same corruption network that targeted your brother." The admission was like a physical blow. "You lied to me. I told you what you needed to hear to keep fighting. Just like Rick did. Just like everyone who's been trying to protect you while building this case." Dr. Webb's voice cracked slightly. "My sister was a federal prosecutor working with James Washington. She was killed 3 days before she was supposed to testify before a grand jury. So when you supported me that first day, I was following a federal script designed to keep you engaged and fighting. But Evelyn, everything I felt, my admiration for your courage, my respect for your principles, that was completely real." Evelyn closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the scope of manipulation and genuine emotion that had been wrapped together throughout this entire ordeal. How many people were in on this? More than you might think. Agent Patterson has been running this operation for 2 years. Warden Thompson at the prison has been feeding information to federal investigators. Even Amanda Walsh in Chicago, she's been coordinating with federal prosecutors while maintaining her cover as a cynical journalist. And the break-in at my apartment, staged by federal agents to make the corruption network think they were in control. We needed them confident and careless enough to reveal the full scope of their operation. The manipulations were breathtaking in their complexity, but Evelyn found herself focusing on one crucial detail. What about Marcus? Is he safe? Dr. Webb's smile was the first completely genuine expression Evelyn had seen from her. Marcus was transferred to federal protective custody yesterday. He's safe, and all charges against him are being dropped. The evidence that convicted him has been proven to be fabricated. Relief flooded through Evelyn like warm water, followed immediately by a new kind of fear. And me? What happens now? Now you recover from your injuries and prepare to testify before a federal grand jury. Your evidence and testimony will help convict 37 people involved in systematic corruption across multiple agencies. Dr. Webb paused. There will be threats, attempts at intimidation, probably some danger. But you won't face it alone. As if summoned by her words, the hospital room door opened and Marcus walked in. He looked thinner than Evelyn remembered, marked by months in prison. But his eyes were bright with something she hadn't seen in years, hope. "Hey, little sister," he said, moving to her bedside. "I hear you've been causing trouble." Evelyn couldn't speak through the tears, could only reach for him with her uncuffed hand. The reunion was everything she'd dreamed of during the darkest moments of the past few days. "Marcus, I thought I'd lost you. You did lose me, for a while. But you found something bigger. You found a way to fight back that actually worked." Marcus squeezed her hand gently. "The federal investigators told me what you did. How you refused to compromise even when it meant risking everything. I thought I was going to get you killed. You were going to get me killed if you'd done nothing. The corruption network had already decided I was too dangerous to leave alive." Marcus's voice carried quiet certainty. "But now they are the ones in prison, and we're free." Dr. Webb cleared her throat gently. "There's one more thing, Evelyn. James Washington, the patient you fought to save, he wants to meet you." As if on cue, a young black man in a wheelchair was pushed into the room by a nurse. He looked exactly as Evelyn remembered, except his eyes were alert and grateful instead of unconscious and vulnerable. "Ms. Reed," James said, his voice strong despite obvious lingering weakness, "I owe you my life. When you refused to delay my surgery, you saved me. But more than that, your courage inspired everyone else in this operation to remember why we were fighting." Evelyn looked around the room at Marcus, Dr. Webb, and James, people who'd all been part of a larger story that she was only now beginning to understand. "I don't feel courageous," she said. "I feel like I was manipulated and used." "You were," Dr. Webb said simply. "But you were also given choices, and you chose to fight for what was right even when you thought it would destroy you. That's not manipulation, that's character." James nodded. The federal investigation depended on finding someone who couldn't be bought, threatened, or broken. Someone who would do the right thing regardless of personal cost. "It took us 2 years to find you. And if I'd taken the plea deal, then 37 criminals would still be free, your brother would be dead within a week, and the corruption would have continued destroying innocent lives for years." James's voice carried quiet intensity. "Instead, you chose to upload evidence that will send them all to federal prison for the rest of their lives." The window in Evelyn's hospital room looked out over the city where she'd grown up, where she'd trained as a nurse, where she'd learned that individual conscience could still matter when backed by collective action. The same city that looked different now, not because it had changed, but because she had. "What happens to us now?" she asked. "Now you heal," Dr. Webb said. "You testify. You help us make sure justice is served. And then?" Marcus smiled. "Then we go home and remember what it feels like to live without looking over our shoulders." As afternoon sunlight streamed through the hospital room window, Evelyn realized that the nightmare was finally ending. Not because evil had been defeated forever, but because good people had chosen to fight it together. The system could be changed, but only when individuals refused to accept that corruption was inevitable. Rick had died believing in her strength. Marcus had survived because of her courage. James was alive because she'd refused to compromise her principles. And somewhere in the city below, other nurses and doctors and ordinary people were going about their work, knowing that someone had proven it was possible to fight institutional corruption and win. The victory wasn't just personal. It was a demonstration that the system worked when people made it work. As her family and allies gathered around her hospital bed, Evelyn finally understood what Rick had seen in her from the beginning. Not just the strength to resist evil, but the wisdom to know that some things were worth any sacrifice. The truth had set them free, but only because someone had been brave enough to fight for it. 6 months later, Evelyn stood in the same trauma bay where everything had begun, but the world felt completely different. The morning shift was beginning at Metropolitan General Hospital, and she watched the controlled chaos of the emergency department with new eyes. Eyes that had seen how fragile the institutions that protected people could be, and how much they depended on individuals willing to fight for what was right. "Nurse Reed, we have an incoming trauma," Dr. Webb called from across the department. "MVA, multiple injuries, ETA 5 minutes. Evelyn nodded and began preparing the trauma bay, her hands moving with the practiced efficiency that had never left her despite everything she'd been through. The routine felt familiar and comforting, but it was laid now with deeper purpose. She wasn't just treating patients. She was part of a system that had proven it could be reformed when good people refused to accept corruption. The federal trials had concluded 3 weeks ago. Detective Blackwood was serving 25 years in federal prison. Torino had received 15 years. District Attorney Patricia Caldwell was facing 30 years for racketeering and conspiracy. Hospital Administrator Vincent Kane had been sentenced to 12 years and ordered to pay restitution to every family affected by his policies. Most importantly, Marcus was free, completely exonerated, with all charges dropped and a formal apology from the state. He'd used the settlement money to finish his college degree and was now working as an investigator for the federal task force that continued rooting out corruption in law enforcement agencies. 22-year-old female, unconscious at scene, possible internal bleeding. The paramedic reported as they transferred the patient to the trauma bed. The ambulance arrived with its sirens wailing, and Evelyn found herself thinking about another ambulance 6 months ago that had brought a patient whose case had changed everything. As the paramedics wheeled in a young woman who'd been in a car accident, Evelyn focused completely on the medical emergency at hand. 22-year-old female, unconscious at scene, possible internal bleeding. The paramedic reported as they transferred the patient to the trauma bed. Evelyn immediately began checking vitals while Dr. Webb assessed the patient's injuries. The young woman was stable but would need surgery for internal trauma, the same kind of life-or-death medical decision that had started Evelyn's journey into institutional corruption. "Surgery prep, stat," Dr. Webb ordered, and Evelyn felt a familiar surge of purpose as the medical team worked together to save a life. As they stabilized the patient for transport to the operating room, Evelyn caught sight of 2 police officers in the waiting area. For a moment, her chest tightened with automatic anxiety, a reflex that she was still working to overcome in therapy. But these officers were different. They were there to take a statement about the accident, not to pressure medical staff or interfere with patient care. The federal investigation had sent a clear message throughout the city's institutions. Corruption would be exposed and punished, while ethical behavior would be protected and rewarded. "Good work," Dr. Webb said as they sent the patient to surgery. "Your instincts in trauma situations have only gotten sharper." Evelyn smiled. "It helps knowing that we can focus on medicine instead of worrying about outside pressure." The truth was more complex than that. The past 6 months had been the most difficult of Evelyn's life. Testifying before federal grand juries, facing cross-examination from defense attorneys trying to discredit her, dealing with threats from supporters of the convicted officials, managing the PTSD from Rick's death and her own shooting. But she'd also experienced the most meaningful period of her career. The hospital had implemented new policies protecting medical staff from outside interference. The state medical board had created protocols for reporting pressure from law enforcement. Her story had inspired healthcare workers across the country to speak up about institutional problems they'd previously accepted as inevitable. During her lunch break, Evelyn walked to the hospital chapel, a quiet space where she often went to think about Rick. A small memorial garden outside had been dedicated to healthcare workers who'd died protecting patients, and Rick's name was inscribed on a plaque honoring those who'd sacrificed for justice. She sat on the bench beside his memorial and pulled out her phone. There was a text from Marcus. "Dinner tonight? I want to hear about your first week back on full duty." And another from James Washington, the federal prosecutor whose life she'd saved. "The appellate courts upheld all the convictions. It's really over, Evelyn. We won." The victory felt different than she'd expected. Not triumphant or celebratory, but quiet and profound. Like the satisfaction of a difficult surgery completed successfully, or a patient walking out of the hospital healthy after weeks of treatment. "I hope you can see this," she said quietly to Rick's memorial. I hope you know that your sacrifice meant something. A gentle breeze moved through the memorial garden, rustling the leaves of the trees that had been planted in honor of those who'd fought for justice. Evelyn closed her eyes and tried to imagine Rick's voice, tried to remember his smile from that brief moment when his guard had dropped and she'd seen the man he'd been before corruption broke him. Her phone buzzed with another message, this one from an unknown number. Ms. Reed, my name is Catherine Mills. I'm a nurse in Detroit, and I'm facing pressure from police to delay treatment for a patient they claim is a suspect. I saw your story on the news. Could you talk to me about what you did? I don't know how to fight this alone. Evelyn stared at the message, recognizing the fear and desperation she remembered from 6 months ago. The cycle was beginning again somewhere else, with different players but the same fundamental choice between individual conscience and institutional pressure. She typed back, "You're not alone. Call me when you can talk privately. There are people who can help, and there are ways to fight back that actually work." As she sent the message, Evelyn realized that her story wasn't really ending. It was becoming part of a larger narrative about healthcare workers who refused to compromise patient care for institutional convenience. Rick's death, Marcus's imprisonment, her own near-death experience, all of it had meaning because it was creating a template for resistance that others could follow. The afternoon shift brought a steady stream of patients, each one a reminder of why she'd chosen nursing in the first place. An elderly man with chest pain who needed immediate cardiac intervention. A child with a severe allergic reaction whose parents spoke no English. A homeless woman with infected wounds who'd been turned away from other hospitals. Each case was an opportunity to practice the principles she'd nearly died defending. That every person deserved the best medical care possible, regardless of their circumstances or the convenience of powerful institutions. As her shift ended, Evelyn found Dr. Webb in her office, reviewing patient charts and eating a sandwich that had probably been sitting on her desk since morning. "Charlotte," Evelyn said, using her first name as she had since they'd become genuine allies. "I wanted to thank you." "For what?" "For teaching me that institutions can change when the right people are willing to fight for change from the inside." Dr. Webb smiled, and for the first time since Evelyn had known her, she looked completely relaxed. "You taught me something too. You reminded me that individual conscience isn't just a luxury for people with job security. It's a responsibility that comes with the privilege of being able to help people." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, two women who'd discovered that professional relationships could become something deeper when tested by moral crisis. "There's something I want to show you," Dr. Webb said, pulling out a newspaper clipping. "It's from the Detroit Free Press. About a nurse there who refused to delay emergency surgery despite police pressure." Evelyn read the article, recognizing the same pattern of institutional bullying she'd faced, and the same choice between compliance and resistance. "She called me," Evelyn said. "Asked for advice about fighting back." "And what did you tell her?" "That she's not alone. That there are federal resources available for healthcare workers facing this kind of pressure. That individual courage can create institutional change if it's connected to collective action." Dr. Webb nodded approvingly. "You're becoming a leader, Evelyn. Someone other people look to for guidance about doing the right thing under pressure." As Evelyn left the hospital that evening, she walked past the trauma bay where everything had started. The department was quiet now, between the chaos of the day shift and the different chaos of the night shift. But it felt alive with possibility, a place where lives were saved by people who refused to accept that corruption was inevitable. Her phone rang as she reached her car. Marcus's voice was warm and happy. "Hey, are you ready for dinner? I made reservations at that Italian place you like." "I'm ready," she said, and realized she truly was. Ready for dinner with her brother. Ready for the ongoing legal proceedings that would continue holding corrupt officials accountable. Ready for the therapy sessions that were helping her process the trauma while holding on to the lessons. Ready for whatever challenges would come next in a career dedicated to protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. As she drove through the city where she'd grown up, where she'd faced her greatest test, where she'd discovered that ordinary people could change corrupt systems through courage and collective action, Evelyn thought about the young nurse in Detroit who was facing the same choice she'd faced 6 months ago. The difference was that this time, that nurse wouldn't have to face it alone. Rick's sacrifice had created a network of support for healthcare workers under pressure. Marcus's exoneration had proven that falsely convicted people could be freed when their cases received proper attention. Her own survival had demonstrated that individuals could challenge institutional corruption and live to tell about it. The system could be changed, but only when people changed it. As she pulled into the restaurant parking lot where Marcus was waiting for her, Evelyn realized that the most important lesson from her ordeal wasn't about corruption or courage or institutional reform. It was about the power of refusing to accept that things had to stay the way they were. Some fights were worth having, regardless of the cost. Some principles were worth defending, regardless of the consequences. Some people were worth saving, regardless of the risk. And sometimes, just sometimes, fighting for what was right actually worked. What did this story teach you about the power of individual conscience in the face of institutional corruption? Have you ever had to choose between what was safe and what was right? Drop your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more stories that will change how you see the world.